So with respect to the Trickster then, we have a playlist of 6 videos currently. This will be the 7th that will go on it. And the emphasis of this one is going to be on the personal aspects. In other words, how we actually experience it in our lives. And to understand that, in order to cut through the apparent otherwise chaos, we need to approach it as a field phenomenon. So it occupies several different states simultaneously, some of which are relatively conscious and amenable to access for us, and others that are not. Those that are not, like all things in depth psychology, particularly if we take a broadly Jungian-based perspective, start to disappear once the ego and its understanding of its personal unconscious runs out of the capacity to represent the inner world in relationship to the continuity of the outer world. So that would be, as an arbitrary boundary then, the edge of the personal unconscious as Jung models it, and into the collective. But Jung really, although he did talk about his archetypal model as being psychoid, in other words, they disappear at some point into matter, the bridge to biology is not adequately addressed in his archetypal model. Not adequately. It is there, and it's sprinkled through his collective works, but it's not adequately understood because the biological level is easily accessible, which is something of a contradiction, because if we approach the so-called unconscious through psychology, we meet that sooner than if we approach it as a biological sentience in its own right, which is contiguous or continuous with our ongoing experience. The minute we become psychologically reductive is the minute we collapse into the limitations of the extension under normal conditions of ego psychology. That's really, really important because that's the direction that the academic element within psychology has gone. The behavioral and the cognitive are probably even more contracted than that. So if we start then with that premise that it is a field phenomenon that occupies simultaneous states, and then follow that up with the understanding that essentially all it is homeostasis. Homeostasis that takes on the characteristic representation, form, and function that it does at each level that it occupies. So as we're talking in a biological way at the moment, let's just reiterate what we've just said. Biology is conscious, differently conscious to the kind of psychology that the conscious personality, conscious ego normally experiences or refers to. It is independently conscious, and it is ancient, and it contains highly conserved layers of consciousness that are normally unconscious by psycho-reductive considerations. We've held this view since the 1980s due to our experience mainly at Charing Cross Hospital in London, but also through Pauline's work in psychiatry. I think it's fair to say up to that point we were dyed-in-the-wool, hard, reductive Jungians, and that we thought that everything could be addressed through a broadly Jungian model that was inclining towards archetypal models of representation. But the functional bridge with Jung and medicine and with biology came through his model of complexes, and that is absolutely sound. And I would say it's bulletproof in terms of pressure testing. It stood the pressure test of time over decades. But what was clear was there was still something missing because we had to contract even Jung to work with complexes in the way that he first uncovered. And yet that was what was more practical than anything. So it was Engel, really, who gave us the understanding as a framework of the field nature of information and how it arrives, pools, if you like, at representation at all of these different levels, but not reductively. It doesn't collapse into one level. Nothing does. There is nothing within Engel's person box, as he called it, that is not simultaneously psychosocial and psychobiological. He understood that, but he didn't develop it sufficiently to give us a bridge back to Jung by having an informational understanding of what was going on. And of course, Jung was into parapsychology, and there's no doubt that he was right to be, and that he made great strides in that direction. His concept of synchronicity is extremely useful if it's approached properly. His doctoral thesis was on parapsychology. So basically, it's the extension of consciousness beyond the ego. So he understood all of that. He really did get it early on. But when we apply that and our ongoing empirical experience of parapsychological phenomena, which in a structured way started for us both in 1980, when we were first introduced to John Kane, then where did those kinds of phenomena fit into the biopsychosocial stack? We couldn't reduce them into biology as normally understood, medicine in other words, ordinary psychology. Jung, yes. But social science, you can, but you have to contract so much that you lose all explanatory power other than being critical of phenomena which are clearly and demonstrably real. So it was under that pressure, as applied to real people, that we had to make an attempt at understanding what was going on. Engel had something, there was no doubt about that. But then, of course, something else had to be reckoned with, something which Jung did understand. And that's the games that the unconscious mind will and does play. And typically he reduced that into something parapsychological, but with an emphasis on the unconscious. The difficulty with that is that the suggestion that it's unconscious means you can't reach it through normal conscious means. And yet we all experience, those of us who pay attention, we all experience parapsychological phenomena, but we don't identify subjectively with logging on to that and giving it a context. It comes in and it's usually collapsed into the form of a rather anxious intuition, then superstition, and then cognitive repression. That doesn't make it work for us. So again, what could it be? What process is involved? And his concept of the trickster, as he formulated it, offers a way of understanding, but again, it's disconnected, except insofar as it's set against his model of archetypes. And of course, he says you can't experience the archetype directly, you can only experience a representation of it, which is got some mileage in it, but it's actually not 100% correct by any means at all. So when faced with these problems, that such things as synchronicity, parapsychology, and this phenomenon that appeared to be the trickster were all real and are all routinely experienced by ordinary people who have not been educated in that particular Jungian way, that allows them to contract it and abstract it into a virtual understanding through Jung's theory. They haven't got any of that. They live it, they experience it, they're pressured by it, and they note that it unfolds through, very often, their neuroses or even psychoses. So again, Jung's got something to say about that. But what the heck is it? What is it that turns up, as Jung said, as an archetype, but we're only experiencing representations of it? And yet then he warned about it. He warned about how it appears in myth and culture, religion, and so forth. So all of this meant that we had to attempt to understand it. On the one hand, we had the empiricism of working with people who knew nothing about what they were supposed to believe or experience. They only knew the literal personal empiricism of their lived life and what was going wrong for them. And there was Engel's stack, and we'd already modified it at this point. We'd expanded Engel's person box to become, if you like, a model of Jungian psychology, all the way down to archetypes. Everything was stuffed into that. So we knew that when we went into that level, we were actually already expanding beyond the broad bones of Engel's reductionism into general systems theory. So what the heck is it? And it was then we thought we're going to have to let empiricism lead the way. We're going to have to drop the collective cultural representations, including how Jung talked about it. And the first question then is, what does it do? Well, on the surface, most people experience it in an unpleasant way, hence some of the representations that we get in culture. But then there are other aspects of it to do with humor, comedy, irony, advantage brought through a sudden insight delivered by intuition. So once we assess that and said, well, they're all probably related because they're all a bit skewed in one direction, away from any kind of hardline reductionism, but nevertheless, it expresses lived experience for lots of people. So we thought it's time to test this idea out about what the trickster actually is. But before we do that, and we waltz off only into psychology, what does it appear to be doing? Well, Jung gave a hint and talked about compensation. He also said that the psyche was a self-regulating system. The concept of homeostasis, as that is generally modeled these days, wasn't introduced until the last 15 years or so of his life, and he preferred to use the phrase self-regulation. But we said, okay, homeostasis is self-regulation. From a biological perspective, how does that link with Jung with respect to this phenomenon that we can call, usefully by description, the trickster? And once we asked that question, tested ourselves and tested the people's experience that we were working with clinically, it became immediately clear. Homeostasis is not only biological. A biological perception and modeling of homeostasis brings about problems straight away because we lose contact with the psyche and we think in simplistic, mechanistic, even if they are systems-based terms. And then Anthony Stevens, which was such a huge influence on our life and our work, made the statement that it goes beyond psychology, homeostasis. The homeostasis is acted at every level. That would include systems which operate at the level of physics, chemistry, biology, yes, but also psychology and even the social environment. And once he said that, that was it. The cork was out the bottle. And if that's true, then we should expect to see this trickster phenomenon operating as an extension of homeostasis. And when we considered that, it was, does that mean then that it doesn't work at the level of biology because that's looked after by other systems? Well, clearly the answer is no. It does work at the level of biology because of what we began to understand as superpositioning. It was superpositioned as homeostasis itself is. Homeostasis tends to be, following on from what I've just said, hierarchical insofar as every level, every system that is contained within downstream systems and also by upstream ones as well, all interconnect. Homeostasis working on its own, disconnected from others, will be compromised. As soon as there's a change in the body, for example, that needs to be regulated, then psychology will be affected by that if it is serious enough. If it's minor, we won't generally feel it. But the field of that information is present and is constantly contributing to the homeostasis of our mind. And this is really very clear in dreams. And if we approach dreams psychoreductively, as people tend to do, even Jungians do, then they miss the biological regulatory information which is contained within the dream process. And that, of course, means that goes down as deep as gene expression. And that means it goes down as deep as the fields of information and regulation that are immanent with the genome. All of it is superpositioned and co-present. So homeostasis is stacked, operates at different levels, communicates with everything else. Why then should not the trickster function, as we began to call it, a function of homeostasis? Why should that not also do likewise? So the problem in understanding it is, from the point of view of psychology, is that we are left with generally cultural representations that are locked into state as fairy tales, myths, and the like. So we can sample them, and it's convenient to do so because culture makes information accessible to the ego directly, whereas when it's in the genome and it's being regulated through things like timed release of meta instincts and adaptations. That's not so easily accessible, but we can sample it through cultural representations. And the problem here, including with the trickster, is that if we default to the cultural level of understanding, we can move out of coherence with the biology, even though the biology is ultimately responsible for the cultural representation. We become decoherent. And then there's a tendency to identify, even if only temporarily, with cultural representations. That's information, and it superpositions itself. It turns up within the ego. It turns up within the field of complexes. It turns up in the pressure from the ego through internal projection and even internal transference, which we discussed last time, deeper into the psyche and calls forth compensations for it. But we don't notice them, provided we're focused only on the ego. That means that we're not doing anything practically about liaising with homeostasis at the functional level of what is called the trickster. So the trickster then is homeostasis that appears in specific form in the culture. It operates with biology because it can turn images into representations that are biological symptoms. It can disturb our brain chemistry, gene expression. It can disturb platonic field ingression. It can do all of that way, way outside of our conscious understanding if we take consciousness only to be our psychology. Jung himself said, don't do that. Don't collapse into your ego. There's more to psychology than only that. He understood that biology was important, but what's become clear in the 60 plus 65 years now since his death is that biology is itself sentient. It has a consciousness of its own. But that's still downstream of what is now being understood as platonic levels of consciousness, pure information at a field level. So we should expect that the trickster is operating there as well. It will be constrained to some extent according to the level that it occupies at any moment and what determinants, what factors of self-regulation are, as I say, constraining what the trickster does. But it seems to be that at the psychological and psychosocial level, the trickster is given a lot of latitude to regulate the ego individually, to regulate psychosocial relationships, starting at the dyadic or two-person level, all the way up. It's clear if we look that it's operating there, but we need to understand the biology of it as well. Then we can understand why it can be cruel. Because the trickster will default back, if you think of the Freud-Adler-Jung equation, it will default back to Freud eventually, always, to check its status at that level. And then beyond it will go back to the level of Plato. And at a negative, that's when it's at its most dangerous. A negative form of Plato, if you like, which has decided that something's gone wrong with biology, will then be capable of influencing the collective genome of the human species to move towards a collapse and hopefully a new set point. And individuals are then carried along by that and are then pressure tested by that. And in that pressure testing, we see the superpositioned trickster again. Now, some of the videos we've done in this series so far have to do with politics and with, for example, Donald Trump. So you see it at the collective level, but also at the individual level of Trump in those videos. And we feel that's very important to understand what's going on now. Also at the level of Jeffrey Epstein and what he was able to achieve. And we're going to address this at the personal level in today's video. We're going to look at what happens when people fall under the influence of collectives around gurus, political or otherwise, and what the payoff is for the guru taking the risks that are involved by identifying with the trickster. That's part of the inflation, but there is a payoff which is tolerated up to a point. And individuals need to understand that, because that's how the trickster at the individual level causes people to become attached to gurus, whether, again, they're political or whether they're religious or whether they're psychological, podcast gurus, that kind of thing. There is a dynamic at work there that we need to be aware of in order to understand what's happening to us. And if we need to help other people, to be able to help them. So there's the general background, but we do need to focus individually on how this thing affects us. So we need to know it's biological, it's platonic, it operates through culture, and then everything else is downstream of that, everything, including its apparent hermetic or mercurial, dualistic, bipolar way of interacting. That's its efficient causality at work. And that's a clue, because neurosis works the same way. It divides into opposites. And we're going to cover what happens when the trickster's involved in a neurosis. Can we use it to solve neurosis, or is the trickster introduced the neurosis homeostatically to get us to transcend the duality and integrate, as the Jungians understand that to be? Can we understand that? Indirect pressure, which is not rational cognitively, but is still performing a homeostatic process for us. But if we don't understand what a trickster is, if we only see it as a representation in culture, it's then referred back to arcane religions and belief systems from the past. If it only does that, we are not in living relationship to it as a homeostatic infodynamic in our own lives. So how we approach this is going to be important and a bit unusual. So I'll pause there on the intro. Is there anything you'd like to add first before we progress?
I'm very aware of how things have changed really over time, because when we first worked with it as a principle, as a dynamic clinically, there was so little out there about it. So the people who came to see us, as you rightly say, had no real knowledge or understanding of it. They just experienced it, and in some ways that was a good thing. But now it's with the internet and the proliferation of ideas, it proliferates in a particular form, which of course is essentially a psychological one. You know, you only have to Google trickster and all the trickster archetype stuff comes up, and we're just saturated with it. And so I think if we do anything today, it will be important to get people to understand how collapsed that understanding is of it, as a dynamic. There's nothing in that that tells you that it's biological,
No.
and or upstream of that platonic even. You don't get a sense of that at all. All you get is the traditional Jungian archetypal stuff to do with it, and that is just so collapsed as to be unhelpful, on the one hand, and potentially very dangerous on the other, depending on how you choose to look at it. So I guess we're hoping to dispel some of the myths about it today that abound out there, and particularly the stuff which was dangerous, of course.
Yeah.
Because people need to know about that and to be able to look out for that.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. So there's something that we can say which is controversial, and I'll say it, and that is that an archetype is simply something that you are not conscious of, that is not only psychological. That can be anything. So that's your biology, that's your genome, and that's what's hidden behind the representations that we do receive. That is entirely congruent with Jung. It appears to contradict him. It does not. It's entirely congruent, because he said you cannot be conscious directly of an archetype. Therefore, it represents, or it is something that you are not conscious of. I would modify that to say under normal conditions, that is true. But when we extend the notion of consciousness away from the ego, and this is what we call the Protagorean error. You know, Protagoras said man is the measure of all things. Well, we paraphrase that and say the ego is the measure of all things, which it isn't. But that's what most people seem to believe, that what they know about themselves, and that is Jungian error 101.
Yeah.
But they don't make the statement clearly enough. There's an archetype is something that we are not conscious of, but is part of the field, the determining field of our extended mind. And that extension goes beyond what we normally consider to be psychology. That gives us a kind of a clean slate to look at it. So I will throw it open now if anyone would like to ask a question, make an observation. Everybody okay thus far? Okay. Let's go into the cards. Now, I'm not going to follow them in a linear pattern. I'd like to get to the meat of this fairly quickly and then go back and discuss some of the earlier cards. But we'll start with the opening one. Right, so this image is relatively familiar. This has appeared in all of our videos thus far about the trickster phenomenon. So just to recap again, we're saying it's a complex. It's a complex because complexes form around our experience. So the configuration of whatever we understand of the trickster forms a referential, systematized, and sometimes autonomous and independent complex that exists at different levels. Superstition is one of those. And the occult, of course. The occult's usually more systematized than superstition, but it's certainly incorporated in a field at infodynamic sense. So anybody you know who is superstitious in any way at all, or is vulnerable to the occult, and therefore vulnerable to the non-ego, the kind of things that the Jungians call the shadow, for example, will be vulnerable to this. And the awful thing is that the trickster, as a function, tests us all the time. And it will test us casually. It will test us through humor. It will test us through the irony of fate. It will test us through mental illness. And it will tempt us into inflation. So we have to be really careful about what we do about this. So let's see if we can move this on. Should be able to. There we go. This will be the next one. And this is to do with defining things. But I want to move even beyond that, straight into this. This is the trickster function, how it tricks you. This is the beginning of, if you can understand this, of an ego consciousness. If we take the starting point that we began with today, where we kind of laid the information broadly on the table and said, this is what we're up against, but this now is the beginning. If we can go through this, we can work through this, then we're beginning to see what is going on with this function. Obviously, a lot of this is going to be negative. The trickster's only negative when it needs to be, and that's an important thing to understand. Homeostasis wants to get us into the most optimized position of adaptation. So that fundamentally will be the brief that's been delivered from the Platonic field through the genome up into our psychology via our instincts, of course, to optimize adaptively as well as we can. But the trickster comes into very, very complicated situations because it works through superpositioning. It's adapted well to that. And it will make micro adaptations, and it will make macro ones as well. And if we want to be conscious of this, which means we can then participate and collaborate with the trickster, we need to build an ego position that understands when it's working against us, metaphorically, how it tricks us, why it's doing that, and what we need to do. So we'll start at the bottom then. The trickster is a function of homeostasis. We've already established that. And I'd like to move around here to the left. Its representation mirrors maturity and psychopathy in individuals and cultures. I'll say a few things about this now. I would like to receive, if you guys can reach in and find some questions so we can elaborate upon this very important point. Frequently, you'll see the trickster is represented as an adolescent, a fool, a theriomorph where it's part animal, so it has a lower level but instinctive aspect of consciousness to it. Then it gets represented psychosocially in the medieval court jester. The court jester was allowed to tell the truth to the king, provided it was put in such a way that was indirect and humorous, couldn't go too far, which again tells you it's homeostasis. So in that sense, the representation reflects back through the culture and its representations to individuals. What are you linking with respect to this? Are you seeing somebody who is immature, puerile, adolescent at best in terms of their development? A fool, certainly, because they get beyond themselves and inflate. Because if you're linking with that, if you're attracted to that, that mirrors back to you something about the level of ego maturity that you have. And that should be a warning. The fact that you've constellated that within your ego consciousness is noted on the inside. It will be noted on the outside too, because it will affect your behavior. It will affect how you reach your goals. That is red rag in its extreme to the trickster function to take on the role that you've internalized. That becomes then internally projected, a deep structure complex. It reflects back to us the warning. This is the state that you are in. Take note, or else you will be regulated by a force that you do not understand, except through the representations that you've internalized and found so attractive and interesting. So beware of influences that suggest that it's a good thing to identify as being a court jester, or to be corrupt, or to be Freudian in the extreme in terms of your gratification, that there's something that you can get off with about that. There is, but it's dangerous, because in the moment, meta instincts will be channeled into the negative side of things and become what Freud understood by the id. Freud also understood that you only get away with that for so long before culture decides to take action against you. And before that happens, you're very likely to get psychosomatic issues, you get dissociative disorders, all sorts of neuroses. But if you keep pushing with it, then it will be moved into the culture and you'll find it there. As Jung said, if we don't pay attention to the inner world, we find it in the form of fate on the outside. And that includes the compensations that come from within. And it will be the trickster function that organizes the field of that. And it can be very, very seductive, because one of the things it will do is to offer inflation. Go beyond where you're at now. Inflate even more. There is an exception to this, and we'll get to it. But it's the fundamental element that happens with a mistake like this. The trickster will often amplify the error for us, because we're too stubborn to receive a gentler correction from within. We're too driven, too inflated, too collapsed. For example, dark triad types don't have an off button. They can't change if it's a genetic version of the dark triad pathology. They just keep going and they inflate further and further. And we will get to that in due course. So when we look at it and experience it in other people, if it's interpersonal and there's humor involved, yeah, we can get that, because there's always something delivered via intuition and handed to us, if you like, by the trickster that can help us to relieve pressure and understand group dynamics. But we have to know where the cutoff point is, beyond which we start to become a problem to ourselves and to other people, and therefore invite correction from the trickster function itself.
So we're given several chances to self-regulate,
Yeah.
really, aren't we?
Yeah.
And if it goes too far, as you say, and is therefore represented in the culture, and you're still not getting the message, then, by the time you get to that point, really, that's a precipitous place to be.
Yeah.
But it's not impossible to pull back from that.
No.
But we need to understand that we're given several chances, really, to get it right.
Yeah.
And then if we don't understand what's happening, we don't self-regulate, then that's a problem potentially, not only for ourselves, but for others as well.
Yeah.
Because we can take other people down with us, depending on what our own individual fate is.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Paul. Would anybody like to ask any questions? Or raise issues or clarifications, you'd be very welcome. It's heavy stuff already, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll move to the other side of the wheel. So it's experienced as mercurial or hermetic and is Janus-faced. In other words, it can be a healer or it can be a harmer, in simple terms. We experience it that way, and it's elusive, hence mercurial or hermetic. The problem with that is both the mercurial and hermetic designations within that statement imply that there's a solution that can be found within culture and within the history of ideation, philosophy, depth psychology, and so forth, that can allow you to solve it. So you might be tempted to go off into Jung and start reading the collected works line by line, that kind of thing, page by page, volume by volume. None of that is actual lived engagement. It's a distraction, it's a displacement. That will provoke a reaction from the trickster because you're turning it into a virtual abstraction which doesn't relate to the issue of why it's appeared in your life or why you feel the way that you do. Mercurial, hermetic, yes, descriptively, but don't go waltzing off into elaborate fantasies to do with what that might mean. That is not about adapting to everyday life. And there are so many people who are led Pied Piper-like into that kind of thing and start to not live a proper life. As Jung himself said, it's a provisional life. Jung's collected works were a statement on his own personal myth. That's it. It doesn't mean it's generally applicable to everybody else. He said you have to find your own way. You have to pressure test your own path. So by all means refer to these things, but don't be seduced by them because you will lose your grip on outer reality. And if there's a fracture line within anybody's personality or circumstances to do with becoming neurotic or even latently psychotic, as Jung talked about it, or even frankly psychotic, then that kind of thing will uncover it. Because there is no work solution. Jung represents processes, but he does not give you a worked solution to the problem of these things. You just get more and more and more of the same thing, what we call lateral distribution. You're none the wiser afterwards, other than having accumulated other ways of saying the same thing. But you're still not in a proper lived relationship to it, even though he says you should be. He doesn't tell you how to do it. Everything is disappearing downstream, another image. And each time we do that, apparently moving after these images, we're retreating deeper into ourselves psychologically, but we're not relating either to our biology or to our social and natural environment. That's a balloon to be popped, unfortunately, for a lot of people. They won't want to do it because they prefer the fantasy to the reality. But what they're doing or will do is actually make the trickster more of a problem because it cannot self-regulate somebody who distributes themselves into a whole ecology of alternative ways of being self-deluded and not engaged with life. So it's experienced that way, but we need to know what we're up against. A barefoot approach, in other words, somebody who is grounded, they've got their feet on the ground and they're relating to the real world, will understand that. They will be able to hold a tension between reading Jung and living a real life. And if we're going to work with people as therapists, you've got to do that. Otherwise, you become somebody who carries a drop-down menu of infections, psychological infections, and they will all be delivered to the people that you influence. And it won't even be an original experience. All that's happened is that the informational DNA, if you like, that was held in the field of these ideas has parasitized your ego and then distributed itself. Richard Dawkins understood this when he coined the term meme back in 1976. Way before the internet. Now meme means a different thing. And Dawkins has moved away, sadly, from the idea of a meme. It's probably too psychological for him, given that he's a hard-nosed neo-Darwinist. But that was probably an intuition on his part that was attempting to compensate for him and to his one-sidedness. But he left us with a representation that's important. He said that memes are independently conscious and act under Darwinian selective pressure. Now we have Michael Levin saying that Platonic entities are conscious and intentional and are capable of producing aspects of themselves in this normal, should we say, Einstein-based universe that we have. In other words, beyond quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics covers at least part of that field that allows the so-called Platonic to instantiate. So we really have to be very careful of our definitions and about understanding. This is about building up Lego strands. Be careful who you allow to influence you. And again, Michael Levin has said in the past few days that when you download this information, you don't know what's coming with it. And we've said this for years on YouTube and for decades before that. Michael's doing it independently. And he's looking at the level of information that ingresses into biology. The things can come in with that we're completely unaware of. And because we're disconnected to our biology, we don't receive it properly. We'll get to how you do that shortly. Then we can download all sorts of influences that can change our genome, change our morphology. This is, this is serious stuff. This is not fantasy. This is reality. He's going through all sorts of experimental protocols at the moment to demonstrate that there is truth that would fit ordinary reductive psychological evidence for what he's saying. Our empiricism is different to that. It's come through working with people. And we've always held that the only way to interrogate consciousness is to start with it, within it, and then through its natural representational extension beyond itself. That's congruent with Michael Levin and what he's doing. But it's really important to understand the breakthroughs that are occurring pretty much in real time over this. This is serious stuff. It's not a case of a psychological theory anymore. It's being demonstrated at the biological level. And of course, most psychologists dismiss biology. They have no understanding of it at all, except that it's another discipline and there's some kind of Markov blanket. And that psychology proper is on the other side of the boundary of that Markov blanket to biology. And when you shift into biology, you use biological speak. Even when there's biological psychology, which attempts to bridge that gap, both sides of that line reduce because they lose something, because they're having to consider the other side, but in a collapsed way. So that is actually a reductive way of understanding it. It doesn't build up understanding at all. So even biologically based psychology, unfortunately, does not help. Consciousness, whatever it is, needs to be experienced from within itself. Because as Jung said, it's all we've got, ultimately. So we have to find out how to extend it. But these are really important things. Would anybody like to comment or ask any questions on that point? Ryan, you're leaning forward. Is that with intention to speak?
Not yet. I would love to at some point, but I think I'm following along at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. That's appreciated. Hey, let's move to the other side of the circle again. We've already discussed this, but it's an important thing because this is part of how the Trickster tricks. It is reified. It's turned into something which resembles an independent human personality. Reified in myth, religion, superstition, and mental illness. Jung found it in mental illness. Of course he did. Because the trickster will be attempting to compensate for whatever is the cause of it. Or the trickster may have even brought it about, as we mentioned earlier. So of course, yes, he found it in mental illness. It certainly operates at the level of superstition. But most psychologists of the academic kind, when they approach superstition, for example, it's considered to be irrational. It's got weird beliefs. People need to be taught to be rational, to undergo some kind of cognitive therapy, like reconfiguration of their schemas. Myth as well is an irrational folk tale, and religion too, for hard-nosed, cognitive, reductive psychologists of the academic kind. That's rejected as well. However, what we see in those domains, as Jung understood, to give him his full due, is we're seeing this process at work. So we have to have the fine line, again, between observation and then rejection, observation and engagement sufficiently to give us understanding without us falling under the influence of highly conserved anticipations within the field of the genome that superstition, for example, has some survival value or some regulatory function, that religion does, that myth does, because this is all, we can make positive arguments for all of these, even for mental illness, where that can be channeled into something like shamanism or an opportunity to reboot, which is traditionally what the Jungians have considered psychosis to be. That's probably because they don't deal with frank psychosis. They deal with people who are coming out of it or who are approaching it, or in Jung's catch-all phrase, latently psychotic. In other words, not quite there, but it's possible they may go that way. And in those states that the Jungians favour that are just listed, all of this stuff floats around representationally. And the representations accumulate information to themselves, which are superpositioned. They're in the culture, they're in all of those different states, but there's partly a representation within our meta-instincts as well, because of the highly conserved nature of the ancestral psyche. And when they superposition, and some attempt is made to understand it within the ego, it all depends upon what is determining our understanding. And that includes what might compensate for it. Some of those things include psychological theories in our present zeitgeist. So again, we have to be careful because we know what deep structure complexes do. It's like a first stage of homeostatic mirror holding from the non-ego to the ego to say, this is what you believe, this is what you're doing to yourself. It's so bad we can't let you get any further in because you'll go mad. So you stay there and you play with these ideas, and then you're not going to interfere with the genome, you're not going to interfere with the platonic field ingression, you're not going to interfere with your metabolism or your brain chemistry. You can hold that back in fantasy, but at the moment, your ego's not in a fit state to go any further. That's part of homeostasis. So the trickster will also have a regulatory function with respect to deep structure complexes. The trickster, even though it's reified, is not one thing. You have to remember this. An aspect of it will operate with deep structure complexes. Another aspect will be the overlap between the deep structure complexes, the genome and the platonic field, and then going the other way in terms of hierarchy of organization. It will work with relationships at the two-person level and beyond, then out into culture at every other level, and then into the natural environment, which, of course, is a Darwinian, selective environment all of its own. It always has been. So it's reified in myth, religion, superstition, and mental illness. Again, I'll ask if I'll pause there just in case anybody wants to ask a question. Okay, I'll move across to the other side. The trickster then, its innate sentience is at the field level of intuition. I said before that they work together. They do. The seeking system at a Panksepian level and intuition go together, but mainly at the subjective level. So this is the personal intuition, which is a faculty, and it's described very well by Jung. A faculty of consciousness, we would prefer to call it a faculty because it's a competency. Michael Levin talks about competencies. The ability to receive intuition is a competency of adaptation. And it's a waveform. Sometimes we're more open to it than others, which is a good thing, because too much intuition will be contrary to a focus of adaptation based on immediate experience, or even memory, or even affect as that is delivered, being the carrier wave of instinct, and therefore of the genome. If we're too intuitive, then we start to look a bit strange to ourselves and to others. So in that sense, then, the innate sense is at the field level of intuition. The field level is not subjective personal intuition. It's meta-intuition. In other words, the trickster function must be operating at all levels and consider the regulation of all levels contrasted with each other. So it will only support the adaptation of an individual up to a point. And that point may extend beyond the individual, because a group, an ordinary group at the family or psychosocial level, might need regulating by somebody who for a period of time acts as the medium of expression of trickster regulatory compensatory dynamics for a while. That might be an extended period of time. There's usually one member of the family who carries that representation and compensates for the whole family. That then can become adaptive for that person, and they may then say, I'll try this out I'll extend it because the family is my basic unit of understanding of psychosocial relationships. And we all know people like that. But they often get themselves into trouble because they do lack an orientation to reality beyond the instinctive pressure, the intuitive and therefore homeostatic pressure of the trickster. They can't get beyond that. They can't understand beyond it. Their thinking is disorganized. Their understanding of emotion becomes very subjective. The representations they experience on the inside are highly symbolic and soaked with information that goes beyond those representations. And then that is projected into the culture, and they find all sorts of shiny things out there in an intellectual and gratifying emotional way, which only supports their one-sidedness. And it's that progressively over time which would bring the trickster function into conflict with someone who had been utilizing it for the regulatory benefit of others. But when we realize that its innate sentience is at that field level, then we can generate some distance but relate. We'll come to that when we get to the solution to the how it tricks you card, what to do about it. But that's a general hint that we have to form a relationship to this function at all levels that are occupied so that we can recognize it and work with it. A very important aspect. Okay, would anybody like to, I'll have to ask after every point, just in case, would anybody like to offer anything here at this time?
Well, I was just thinking if you then inject something malevolent into that, clearly, that's a very dangerous situation again, and if it's someone that you're relating to, either in your family or beyond your family, you need to be very aware of that.
Yeah.
It's one thing, I think, as you say, Steve, somebody who maybe fulfills that role as a form of compensation for the family, and it's not malevolent. But where you get that with malevolence of some kind, and which you almost certainly will do in someone who is a dark triad type, that is a very dangerous person. It's a very dangerous combination of factors, and we need to be very aware of that, very circumspect of that if we find ourselves relating to someone who has the characteristics that you've just described, because the malevolence may not be obvious.
Yeah.
You'll get drawn in on the strength of the playfulness, the tricksterishness of the ideas, and the fact that that person may be animated and animating, and so that's a danger point, isn't it?
Yes.
Because we can all lose our sense of separation in relationship to someone like that. But yeah, it can do great things, as you say, in a situation that requires a bit of levity, or another perspective on something. It can infuse new energy, new ideas into that situation, but combine it with something malevolent, and you're up against something completely different at that point.
You're up against evil.
You are, yes. There's no other word for it, really. Yeah, yeah.
And unfortunately, as we all know, dark triad types are often rewarded.
Yeah.
Probably because their scale of reach can influence other people or give them the opportunity for being snapped out of their attachment to things which are destructive. But we can discuss that soon.
Yeah.
Right. So moving over here then, its use is corrupted in occult practices. Occult practices rely on unconscious representations which utilize symbols that have behind them things that are not obvious. The obvious bit of the symbol is what's threatening to people. That's what keeps them caught in the fear of attachment to whoever the occult individual is. But like with all representations, if we know how to relate to them, we get beyond them and we can find the compensation behind them. And part of the role of the trickster is to expose us to things which would disturb us so we can mature in our understanding of what representation is. But people who are inclined towards vulnerability to superstition and then find themselves pulled into the occult get fixated on a representation which is controlled. And the paradox is that the trickster will try really, really hard to snap a person out of their attachment to these images and the beliefs that have been embedded within them. And of course, this goes back to, it did surprise me, I'll be honest, with what Michael Levin was saying the other day about be careful what you download from the Platonic realm or domain, as he calls it, because there will be things there that you didn't bargain for. And thought, well, that's insight. For a biologist, of course, he's not an ordinary biologist. He's a very advanced and developed psychologically individual. But it was still a bit of a surprise that he'd actually got that far. And bearing in mind that he said that he's working with a team of people and he's made all sorts of progress on things and he's not yet ready to release all of it, then I think he's probably made a great deal of progress in this direction of understanding. But at the moment, he's communicating with people who are way, way behind him. And it's interesting to see how they react to him, but that's another topic, really.
Well, the closest myth, say, in culture to that would be something like Pandora's box.
Yeah.
So, so anyone who understands that, who understands the narrative with respect to that, is actually understanding more than a lot of the, as you rightly say, Steve, the academics that surround Levin. Because at least they understand at a human level how these things operate, which is this, you open Pandora's box and, you see what you want to see. You don't necessarily see the sprites, you see the shiny things and so on.
Yeah.
And get distracted by them. But it's again, there's a lesson, isn't there? There's a warning in there about how to do things and how to do there is a way of doing these things properly.
There is.
If you understand what's really going on. So yeah.
Yeah. So its use is corrupted. Thanks, Paul. Use is corrupted in occult practices because it's part of the entrapments of being in a state of unfamiliarity with what the trickster is. The trickster's turned into some form of demon or devil, which is a step on from saying it's mercurial or hermetic, but it's not much of a step to shift somebody's understanding of it into that. And of course, if they've got some, as I said before, education in Jung, then it's so easy to say to them, that's your shadow. And that the leader of the occult cult is some kind of representative of the self archetype. That's how they do it. they give that impression, and then they get the religious things projected onto them, and ideas of elevated wisdom and that kind of thing, which they just use. So the trickster will attempt to snap people out of their attachment to the occult. But depending upon the state of the ego, the vessel that receives its hints, even the trickster can be corrupted via representations into something that supports the attachment of a suffering individual to a cult. But when you break that spell, when that is broken and you allow the trickster then to become the psychopomp, then that's the end of the attachment to the cult. And we'll come to that. It's a hugely important distinction between the two. Right, I'll move on unless somebody wants to ask a question at any point. So humor is part of its regulatory field, as is irony. Humor's got a great deal of social advantage because it bonds people and groups together. It allows tension to be diffused, but it can become manipulative. It can be a form of abuse and control. So humor also tends to join things together intuitively that we wouldn't necessarily see go together. So again, the trickster would say, intuition is a good way of presenting broadband informational field resonance. Humor is a way of engaging somebody. Therefore, humor and intuition go together in order to regulate a situation. People who are humorless are often people who have contracted to the point where they can't self-correct. And at that point, humor turns into irony. But maybe that will get through. Now, irony is variously defined. One of the definitions is that condition wherein people are mocked by fate. And that sounds awful, and it can be. But when people accept irony and see the humor in it, irony's turned into humor, then there's a reduction in tension and stress. And in that moment, potentially a person is available to relating to the non-reified function. Non-reified, if that's always going to be key here. A non-reified trickster function who will deliver through intuition the next step that they need to take and then to consolidate into their cognition. Not abstractly, not virtually, but as a result, an end process of an adaptation which eventually becomes cognitive and then easily accessible. So that's how humor and irony are related to the trickster and how the self-regulation can operate through it. Moving across then, identifying with it is pathological. End of. That's it. There's no get out of jail card on this. If somebody identifies and says, I am, if they say it openly, then they probably, at a minimum, half believe it. Half believing it is dangerous for them, and it's dangerous for others because that's only their conscious belief. Their non-ego conscious belief through the field of complexes, including the deep structure complex, might well be, I am that thing. I am that force of nature. I can control people. Now, why would that be allowed? We're going to come to this. Again, I did hint at it before. But there's a way, a function at a group level through which, I'll call it a psychopathic or dark triad type, can influence others to correct them, given an opportunity. And it's almost best described in mythopoetic terms, but we should not identify with the mythopoetic expression of it, because that distances us. It just becomes an image with no experience. And the experience has to come with first of all, the internal pressure testing of it as objectively as we can, and then looking for evidence and testing that evidence outside of ourselves. So identifying with it is pathological. It invites psychological inflation and destroys its host. That is fairly routine, but again, we've got this caveat. So it's operating on both of these points. So we're going to get there. Dark triad types, we've just explained a bit of this, claim to be its master in an attempt to buy off fate by sacrificing their victims and followers. So this is where I was going with this. That you'll get people who control how other people think and react and what they internalize and believe in such a way with, say, a narcissist, a malignant narcissist who is an internet or podcast or cult guru, to such an extent that they can inflate themselves, but they buy off the result by transferring that onto the people they influence, who are in effect their victims and followers. They then get the hit, and they, as an individual, do not. And in terms of homeostasis, what happens is that it's like an algorithm. It says, well, there are 50 people here and they all need regulating. And there's one person who also needs regulating, but they are acting as an efficient cause to bring about the other people's inevitable collapse and regulation. So we'll leave him alone and we'll just focus on his followers and his victims. And they're left there. This happens at the group level that I'm talking about, but it goes beyond that because it goes into the realm of politics as well, which we're going to cover. But if such an individual is in that state, then their groupthink, their projections, their transferences and identifications with what the medium, because such people act as mediums to negative things, what the medium of this individual cult leader is pushing, then they feel adapted in some fantastical way at the level that the group leader is adapted. Oh yeah, well, I can be just like him or her. I will participate in the field of their influence. I will be rewarded. And every time they think that, then they're shrinking a little bit more, a little bit more. The character is compromised. That's really serious. They can get inducted into doing bad things, compromising themselves to such an extent that when the ethical and moral shock of their behavior is presented to themselves, is held up for them to see, and the trickster will do that, that can bring them down, or society will bring them down, or their biology for mental illness will bring them down. But such people can operate for quite some time by farming other people, bringing them into their circle of influence, and then distributing the effect amongst them. And then they get off it. They're a parasite at that point, and they're tolerated. Not forever, but they're tolerated. Internet podcast gurus and cult leaders attempt to control others through it. They'll often give off this tricksterish imago, an image, because that suggests that they have, in a mercurial or hermetic sense, some kind of secret knowledge that only they know, and that they deliver it through humor. All of these things, if you think about it, are psychopathically inclined towards control of others. And people who are vulnerable, it's very sad, but it does happen. And as you said, Paul, the internet's allowed this to just go exponential.
Oh yes, it's crazy, really, isn't it? The reach of the internet, but it is massive. And as you say, some of these people will go as far as to suggest that they are an avatar of the trickster.
Yeah.
So they will come up with some kind of descriptive term to represent who they think they are in relationship to the trickster. And again, that's a clue, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a clue to people who are starting to be attracted to them, to say, hang on a minute, that's too much. That's gone too far. But of course, if they don't spot the hubris in that other person, it's pretty much like a moth to a flame.
Yeah.
Really, it is such a dangerous dynamic when it goes wrong.
Yeah.
And as you rightly say, the casualties very often are the people around the individual, the guru, the internet guru, who facilitates the relationship to them, and they just don't see it. It's as if fate has to have a hand at some point for them to see it.
Yeah.
And of course, it's better that it doesn't get to that point, but fortunately, it does for a lot of people.
they've always been like this.
They had.
Before the internet.
Oh gosh, yeah.
There were plenty of gurus like this, but there's more of them now because the ecology supports their propagation, doesn't it?
Oh yeah.
Mass suicide cults in the past were examples of that.
Very good ones, yeah.
Yeah, people. Jonestown, for those who are familiar with that, I think it was 1978.
Yeah.
There's still film available on YouTube of hundreds of dead bodies flying face down. They all took the poison because they were directed to. That is contra naturam up to a point. There will come a point when biology will give up on an individual and say, you are so maladaptive, you are so beyond correction that you're dangerous, and therefore follow this guy then to hell, if need be. Just get out the gene pool, because the influence that you've identified with would be replicated, even if it's not genomically, through influence and suggestion through families or whatever. So at the extreme, they can be, the near extreme, they can be that bad. The absolute extreme is where you get psychopathic political leaders who are enthralled by their identification with this hermetic trickster function. And they can destroy the world.
Yeah. They don't care how many people they take with them to it. It's almost amusing for them.
It is, yeah. Yeah.
And they do take people with them in large numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're nearly at the end of this particular card, so I'll move on. So I say it acts as a gentle, I don't mean gentle, an agent-like process in Darwinian selective pressure testing. So in other words, you'll always find the trickster where there is particularly extended fields of influence, things that bring people into relation to others through identity, hatred. For example, desiccation, because that brings about selection. Darwin will actually support the catabolism and competition, which leads to a collapse in a population through civil wars or through all kinds of manufactured hate as an excuse for that, because that will bring through a more resilient, it seems, group of people. Except, of course, history suggests that the change has not really been that successful, that people don't learn from history that well. And it forces you to face yourself through paradox. And this is the invitation to walk through the door of neurosis if we don't understand something. One thing is true, the other thing is true. They're both bad, I can't get rid of either of them. Or one is light, one is dark, they cancel each other out. What does that mean for me? What am I? Now, anything that involves duality can be extended into the notion of paradox. The manipulation of paradox means the choices cannot be made. That affects cognition first. Then it is felt at an affective level, because instincts can't help you at that point. You're not going with an instinct enough to understand the scenario that you're in. So it's a cognitive track, which then disturbs affect. Then the affect produces representations as internal images, which keep us hypnotized and trapped. And intuition itself is collapsed too, because only the intuition that supports the neurosis is allowed through. And at the local individual level, it will be a complex that forms dynamically through these stages that attempts to keep the person together. And the complex, of course, as you know, splits off under Jungian pressure. It becomes a subnuclear, as he put it, of consciousness, a split-off partition part of the ego that starts to defend itself because it has been set up to defend the ego, and the ego doesn't know how to help itself. The ego's incompetent. So the complex will do it. And after a while, if the ego starts to improve, the complex sees the ego as the problem. And then you have a long-term neurosis, and long-term in the sense that if people aren't held properly with it, it can stay for life. So again, paradox, duality, these are all problematical. Representations, they're hypnotic, whether they are individual internal images that spontaneously occur, whether they are ingressed fantasies from other people, representations in the culture. They all go in, and then they fall into the field of complexes, and they are sampled, and then they feed the complexes. Homeostasis starts with deep structure complexes, and the trickster ramps up, instinct starts to push, and then gradually the integration of a person's life reverses into disintegration. And that's when they need help, and the trickster can help them. But not if they see a reified human personality doing all sorts of mischievous things. It isn't like that in reality. They can function with the appearance of it, but don't be attached to the appearance. It's an illusion, a process illusion of experiencing a factor which sums up the non-ego to the ego. Once you get that, it's simple. It's simple to detach. The East has ways of doing it that the West doesn't have. The East has its own problems, but it does that really well.
At least it understands it's an illusion.
It understands that
Yeah.
it's all baloney.
Yeah.
It's just not real.
Yeah.
So ultimately then, the highest register, its role in politics is to bring platonic pressure to bear through the efficient cause of Darwin. And what that would mean then is that the assessment of where life is at, and consciousness specifically through life, that is biology, will be handed over to Darwin to bring about correction in order to optimize the potential for the platonic to ingress. The trickster will attempt to regulate that. If we're not in contact with that, though, properly and understand it, we won't be able to distill the understanding and eventually the meaning of what's going on at a higher register scale, because we'll be distracted by all the obvious things. I think it's fair to say that what's going on in the world now is a huge distraction and a competition between various Darwinian selective pressures behind which there is Plato, and through which the trickster is operating at a collective level. And how we respond to that is going to be really, really important for our survival. And the series that we did on the phenomenon of Donald Trump, without being political about that either way, he has become even more hermetic and mercurial and unpredictable than he was before the last month or two. So he's occupying that role now, without a doubt. And he's riding a tiger while she's got hold of its tail, and he's pulling it rather inappropriately, because at some point, if he's not careful, he will be ruthlessly sacrificed. As the meta level of regulation operated by the trickster would potentially turn on him and shred his entire life and everybody around him, and even beyond. So the trickster's operating at all of those levels, but if we focus on the level of the individual, we can place ourselves in any of these relational states and understand what we need to know. And if we need to help somebody who is superstitiously attached to the influence of ideas or of individuals who are harmful to them, then we can work on that too. So there you go. There's the trickster function. It's not complete, this, in terms of how it tricks you, but there's a broad brush of scenarios there. So stop sharing the image, but we can share together communication. Anybody like to comment on that? I appreciate it's been a long one, hasn't it, so far?
Yeah.
Jess, go ahead, Jess. Great to see you.
Hi. I'm sorry, I know I missed the start, but one thing that I was thinking about was the kind of trend in society to, well, in Western society, to go and do ayahuasca and DMT, and how people report like similar entities, I guess, that they come into contact with on their ayahuasca journey, or whatever they, however they describe it. And yeah, I was wondering about that, like the trickster involved in that. Seems like
Really good point, isn't it? if we take a purely Jungian perspective and then move on through other people who have commented on the use of psychedelics or related substances, then Jung would almost certainly have said that what people experience are representations of the collective unconscious. So he would take that as being absolutely real as an experience. And the coalescing into similar enough entities. And I've seen recent people on YouTube who are suggesting that, and they're taking it as being absolutely real that they're in those states. I think Jung was doing a bit of a disservice there, because regardless of what they're reporting, it's still the product of disrupted brain chemistry. If such things could be accessed in a meaningful way without psychedelics of any kind, then I would say that the representations are more likely to be 24 carats, should we say, rather than 9. So in other words, you'll get representations for sure, and because of this disrupted brain chemistry at every level, you'll get narratives, you'll get all of that, but it's not been delivered naturally by a brain which is in a proper homeostatic state. So I would say there's the representation issue again. What am I looking at, and what do I believe about what I'm looking at? And if I take a substance, then that will override so many things and will produce a belief based on an experience which is induced by a chemical. But there are plenty of ways of accessing things that don't include chemicals. But I will be very interested, of course, to see what Michael Levin's got to say. Now, he may go that way. I hope he doesn't, to be honest. And I love Rupert Sheldrake, but for me, one of the very few disappointments about him is that he's pushed that. When you can see what happens to a lot of people that go through these experiences, that are suicides, that are intractable depressions, schizophrenia, all sorts of things occur. Whereas if you do it properly, none of those things are a risk. So for us, it's forgive the pun, a no-brainer that you should not mess with chemicals to induce representations that are based on chemicals.
Yeah, I think you've got the superpositioning with the culture there as well, because if you go back to, say, the 60s and the 70s counterculture, when there was the same kind of experimentation going on, it was a very different world. And obviously it was the hippies who pushed that kind of lifestyle, that kind of experimentation with psychedelics. But collectively, it was much more to do with love and peace, albeit naive in very many ways. Whereas now that I think there is so much more, unfortunately, much more hate than love being pushed.
Some of hate instead of love.
Indeed, yes, yeah. And so, you would have to take that into account as well. And then again, as we said before, also the internet, because of the capacity to, extend influence and to extend reach is more than it's ever been before. So you can't escape superpositioning. Everything's in a context, isn't it? Whereas in an individual context or a collective one, when we come to look at groups and the way that groups function socially. So I think that is a difference, and I think it's probably the case, given Rupert's age, that he was likely part of the first, push in that regard with respect to the hippie culture and the use of psychedelics and so on. And that's his association to that will be a positive one.
Yeah.
But the use of it now is, by and large, is not positive. And I think, apart from maybe the odd occasion where there might be some therapeutic use, I mean that in a medical sense, for someone to alleviate some kind of physical disease or suffering, I think beyond that, it has to be seen as a negative.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing that you cannot do yourself in the absence of those substances. If you need to, there are other safer, healthier, more homeostatically aligned ways of getting the result that you want. So there's a lot to consider, isn't there? I mean, it's a very far-reaching question, Jess, that you've made there, and so many potential caveats to it.
Yeah. And the emphasis that you placed on the trickster's role, I think that's really worth considering, Jess,
Yes.
because it could work to attempt to squeeze out something, a positive from a negative, or it could say, this is so stupid, I'm going to make you suffer, to the point where you wake up and stop doing it. And you get that with ordinary compensations for homeostasis, don't you? That
Do.
you keep getting given the problem until you change your approach to the problem
Yes.
and see beyond it.
Yeah.
So the trickster will just amplify that. That's its role, really, is to amplify things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then there are others who just believe in it, and that can be pushed out through cults, of course, of various kinds. But we see a lot of people who've been badly damaged by psychedelics, and each one of those lives that have been damaged, and the lives they damage, even indirectly, none of that would have happened had they never gone near them.
Mm.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't touch them. I wouldn't trust anything that came out of it. Couldn't do.
Yeah.
People do talk about having, I mean, I've never tried it or anything, but people do talk about having positive effects from it. I mean, some people I've met who talk about their ayahuasca journey are completely convinced that that's helped them. And they completely believe in the, I think mother ayahuasca is one, like, yeah, that there's people in that realm that they, well, not people, but entities, I guess, that they meet in that realm. And yeah, it's, so I guess that, yeah, there's two main levels, I guess, the collective unconscious and the trickster function kind of both playing a role there, and I'm sure many other things.
Yeah. And of course, there is, to be fair, and as balanced as I can be, there is always potential positive outcomes where a person's life isn't harmed ever in any way as a result of an experience, and then they then become more useful to themselves and others. And I wouldn't deny that. If somebody's experienced that, I could not deny it, and wouldn't. It would be completely wrong at every level to do that. So I treat it the same way as I do a religious belief. I accept it, that that's what the belief that they hold. But where someone has harmed themselves or harms others, I don't judge them, but I know that they need help, which means it's not like the ideal religious experience, whereas nobody is harmed by it. For a believing Christian, you shouldn't be harmed by Christianity. Some are, of course, but you shouldn't be. So the ideal behind it is that. But when it's a substance, it's a shortcut to scrambled by brain biochemistry, and you don't know what's going to happen. And people do say that. There are plenty of people on the internet who says I've never recovered from it years later. The flashbacks and things. So not for me. But I would never judge an individual. I'll just say at the level of approach to it, I wouldn't go near it because I don't believe it's necessary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Great question. Thank you. Hi, Ryan. Oh, you're muted.
There we go.
There you go. Yeah, great.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Ryan.
Great to see you.
Good to see you guys too. I wanted to harken back to something you said earlier about somebody who develops a relationship with the trickster to survive their family dynamic, and how that gets maybe systematized into something that extends into the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And how that maybe uses the person up, or maybe different terms for that specific scenario. But
yeah,
how would you approach someone like that? What would you do for them?
Okay.
How would you help them to help themselves?
Right. I think the starting point would be to what extent it's actually a problem, or it's a management adaptation which is continued on, and it wouldn't need, therefore, completely dialing down, but a different relationship to what they have. For example, there are plenty of people who are, in a Myers-Briggs sense, highly intuitive in an extroverted sense, as Myers-Briggs would understand that negatively you could say they're all over the place and can't settle on anything. And fantasy is more important than reality in relating to others. But in a positive sense, you could say they start things all over the place that other people benefit from. So they're like a catalyst for change. So it wouldn't need taking away completely. And I'm thinking of the trickster. I'm not moving too far away. In fact, you couldn't. It would depend on the relationship you had to someone and their insight into themselves. So if they were, full bore extroverted intuition, almost manic, which is diagnostically a step beyond that, but it's almost a hypomanic perhaps sometimes, then it would be helping them to relate to wider parts of themselves that could bring about more efficiency in their life. And one-on-one, I would definitely use altered states of consciousness, because that would present something which would draw energy out of the extroverted intuition, which they can experience, or they experience the partitioning. Whereas if it's presented as an idea, this is something you should do, that can be overridden so easily by intuitive pressure. It's just, wow, no, I've got 100 other things I want to do. I'll do them. You're telling me to stop doing them. But if we induce an altered state of consciousness so they feel the division, but not damagingly, but in a way that makes them feel less pressured, and then introduce the notion that the energy thus saved can be deployed to do other things which sustain over time, rather than a bright flash of light and it's gone. We need another bright flash of light, more of them, which can happen with extroverted intuition. It's too extended. It just depletes. It depletes people around them. So, so people have to feel something subjectively. In other words, they need to be conscious of the difference within themselves. I would hazard the guess, I'll call it that, because we're speaking hypothetically. Any individual within that is different slightly. Hazard the guess that the trickster would favor that, because it would mean that homeostasis was being optimized, not collapsed. Whereas if there was a cognitive approach, say, and it's you should do this, you shouldn't do that, right? So that usual crap, that they come out with, that will be resisted because it will take everything away. And Milton Erickson would probably agree with this notion of redirecting things. And Milton Erickson, we could argue, was tricksterish because he facilitated optimization. So that would be my sort of starting point with any hypothetical in-person case that presented like that, would be not to eliminate the drive or eliminate the apparent free-floating trickster. Because you can't. It will turn on you yourself, and you'll get poltergeist and all sorts of phenomena occurring. If there's a disagreement that's going on, for example, or sometimes these things, and perhaps more often, will occur when you're not taking the hint from the trickster that you as a therapist need to go in a particular direction. So it's so wide, isn't it, in its applicability?
Yeah, I think what that does, what you suggested about working one-to-one and getting someone to dissociate it in that way, is that it allows them to experience themselves as other people experience them. Because people who are driven by, in that MBTI sense, by extroverted intuition, don't always realize or appreciate, because it's going away from them all the time, out into the environment, the effects that they're having on other people, just how wearing it can be at times, or sometimes the kind of humor that is attached to that. It may be well intentioned to a point, but it might also reach a point where it becomes a bit too mischievous, in the sense it starts to hurt people. And obviously Freud understood that. He understood about humor and jokes and their relationship to the unconscious and so on. But with somebody who is in that extroverted state and who's running with it and is creating havoc all over the place, they don't always fully understand how that affects other people. So that simple act of dissociation is maybe the first time that they've actually experienced how they are, how they're received by other people. They get some sense of how strong, how powerful, how much energy that there is in the system. And that then, as you say, allows them to transform it, to find a way of utilizing it more productively in their lives. And very often they are hugely productive, creative, imaginative kinds of people, but it's the energy is just chaotic and misdirected, and it just requires somebody to help them to transform it and use it in a more productive way.
That which would stop the trickster hurting them as well, because suddenly there's someone there acting as an agent on behalf of the trickster to help redirect the energy. But the trickster will amplify the error as well as offer the solution.
Yeah,
You get the solution offered first, and then your error is amplified.
yeah,
That seems to be the way that it works.
yeah.
So someone who's been that way in the family, to go back to the exact form of your question, Ryan, the context then and how the past, and it may still be operating, of course, is affecting them right now will be important. If it's the remote past and an older person who may have lost contact with their family, then it's more what we're doing now about the impressions received from the past.
Yeah.
If the family is still an active dynamic, then that has to be taken into consideration. And we need to start ego strengthening, but the redeployment of the energy for sure, because that will help them escape. They will achieve escape velocity then. We've got a high quanta of energy anyway in the form of the intuitive drive.
Yeah.
Well, as we were saying earlier, intuition is always limited. It can't ever come in with its full bandwidth. But with people where it's nearly absolute regulatory capacity, you get that hypomanic
You do.
presentation.
Well, we knew someone like that, didn't we? Who
We did.
had a terrible mother complex.
Yeah.
And there were some very humorous situations that developed around him. One of which was because his mother was always insisting that he ate the food that she gave him, even if he didn't want it. And on this occasion, he received it. She brought it into his room. And he gratefully received it and thanked her, profusely and so on. Walked across the room, opened the window, and literally threw it outside. And I think the dog ate it.
The dog jumped out the window.
Oh, did it jump out the window first? Right. Yes. So so that's how he dealt with some of the difficult dynamics within his family. But he was chaotic. His life was chaotic, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was more like that one scene, wasn't it? In the day.
Yes. Yeah.
He was funny and ethereal, right? But chaos everywhere. Yeah, so we would try and sort out the conditions. Are the family still a problem, or is the family representation currently of a past state, which is part of the self-concept and self-image? Then redirect the energy, because then the pressure will reduce, but the efficiency will go higher. And with a lot of people who are very extroverted and intuitive, they don't want to let go of that because they fear depression. And then you can trace that back to being depressed by the early family dynamics. And the intuition was ramped up to free them through fantasy, for example, from that. But there's often a creative drive that's with the fantasy, but the fantasy is the downside.
It is really, yes, because it doesn't take you anywhere, does it? It doesn't achieve anything that's material in the world. It just stays at that level of representation, and that's problematic.
Yeah. I thought that's a good enough answer for your question. Deserves a good answer. Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
If I have missed anything, could you help me so I can give you perhaps a fuller response?
I only have to say, I think for now, just that I would like to follow up on this.
Yeah.
Because this will be an active thing in my life, with people I might be working with just in a working sense. not as a therapist or a coach, but as working.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's where it begins, Ryan, isn't it? There is, in effect, no separation, because at some point you will be working and the same dynamics will exist within the clinical setting as they do outside of it. So,
So you'd be a psychopomp.
yes, absolutely. You would indeed. Yeah.
Non-formal,
Yes.
crazy wisdom type,
Yeah.
of a psychopomp who makes the adjustments necessary within the field of that
Yes.
person's life. But it's not obvious, maybe, what you've done. That would be a way of protecting yourself to.
Definitely. That would be the goal.
Yes.
Yeah, you can do that. I know you can.
I look forward, hopefully to more diving deeper.
We can do that.
Yeah.
We can definitely do that.
Yes.
It's not one thing, is it? There's so many, again, superpositioned and radiation sort of lines off from that affects so many other things. It's a great place to start.
Yeah, it is. It's the place to start, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the feel of your energy around.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, anybody else like to comment in any way? Everybody okay for now? Okay. Let's see if we can get another in this room. I'll put this one up first. We won't tarry on it for long. Partly because of what Ryan has said, actually. I'll go back. If I'm going to go back to this one, I'll move on. It's this.
Yeah.
The individuation neurosis. If you guys can see that. So we've got the concept of the genomic self, bearing in mind it's not reducible to biology, but it is the ground state for Jung's self-archetype. As that becomes psychological, it must pass through a biological phase, if you like, of representation. But something that goes wrong in the family can lead to this maladaptive trajectory, which branches off from the intended pathway. And that's the unfolding genome along lifespan development. And we can say that's the trajectory of their personal myth, their understanding of themselves. The point of separation, I know it's quite a way up that axis there. The reason for that is that there's a variable amount of division that can occur before homeostasis just moves us back into alignment. But at some arbitrary point that is nevertheless meaningful for an individual's circumstances, there comes a point where it's not going to do that, not without other changes occurring. And then we go on a maladaptive trajectory. The angle that's subtended then basically is the field of the neurosis that goes between what the genome anticipated and what our lifespan development circumstances or complexes have thus far determined. So the trickster will feed off this, feed off the gap, but be aware of the apparent polarity between the two. So the gap then, as far as the trickster is concerned, it doesn't exist. Cognitively, we can see it as being a duality and an opposite, and we can represent it that way because it's easy to represent. But because the trickster is superpositioned and is considering all sorts of different nuances, then it will summate an understanding not as a geometric style division, but as a configured field, which taken as a whole needs to be regulated. If we solve the field, then this representation will solve itself. So that's why we've included this, the individuation neurosis, which is basically where we get off track with our intended development in terms of our potential, is where most of our psychosocial suffering starts. The psychological suffering is before this, that occurs before that final point of separation. Along there, we start to suffer because we're aware of it, but other people may not see it. And then there comes a point and it's a phase shift and we're on a different trajectory and this gap gets bigger with time. That's too sharp a division now from the point of view of a field model. The field model is there's far more going on than is represented. Regulation is in all of those sub-states within the field. You can regulate it locally or you can regulate it at a meta level. And the trickster will run algorithms and will be itself directed by algorithms receiving the impression, and then will come up with something that it can contribute towards healing the split. But usually, for most of us, unfortunately, it takes time to fully configure. But it may offer us a strategy, and that strategy might be becoming the family joker and utilizing the dormant energy within our relatives, and then interfacing with the world through it and gaining an advantage that way, which to another perspective might seem like an inferiority-superiority complex. Within the family, we might be acting in an inferior way, subdominance. In the world, we might compensate with that with being something different that I've just conceived of as being polarized. And that is a way to look at it. But we, again, need to remember that's not the trickster's perspective. It's what's the algorithmic sum of the entire field. It might be that the optimized adaptation right now is you be the extroverted joker on the outside of the family, which you do not have the power or the influence to change. And that by developing a superiority complex, then you will have to force yourself to adapt to your drive pressure, to be this external joker and the person with all of the energy on the outside, rather than give in to being the collapsed, almost schizoid representation of being subdominant within the family. So lots of algorithms to run. And in terms of therapy, always consider the wide field. If you do, and it's an odd thing, the wider field will take an interest in your interest in it. Because there's the potential for self-correction and closing that angle. Whereas if we only collapse in one direction, then it will give up eventually and say, okay, we have to move only in that direction. That's the only direction we're making any progress in at all. The trickster's there to compensate for that. It's there to be a check on the wide field, on the meta-regulatory field, and basically say, okay, what do we have to do to wake up the wide field, the meta-regulatory level? We can put too much drive into this new trajectory. We can make it overdo things. Well, what's that going to do to help? Well, such people are full of life. They make contact and friends with people, in the extreme anyway, relatively easily. That will generate opportunities, and that person will contribute to their own developments and to the development of others, even if it's quirky. That can happen. But not that way in every case, every time. So we can consider it to be algorithmic. So this is why it's hard to pin down the trickster by its alchemically mercurial and hermetic, because cognitively we don't understand. Normally, this kind of layered, field-wide, algorithmically driven meta-regulation, we just don't grasp it. You want things to be simple and polarized opposites. This is good, that's bad, drop bad, good is good. Doesn't work like that. It's too complicated. So what I was saying before is that when we become congruent and enough to receive intuition, meta-intuition, then we reduce pressure on ourselves and things become clear representationally. And at that point, we have to work with that clarified representation to go beyond it. That stops us falling into the trap of attachment to gurus, whose personal inflation compensates for our deflation or sense of inadequacy, the need to borrow competence from someone who appears to be highly functioning. And they're not, of course. They're feeding off you. They're parasitizing your life. They're taking your libido. Once you see through that, and you can detach that Eastern principle of non-attachment again, and then you have that field relationship, the trickster works for you to the extent you don't even notice it's there as the trickster. It may well only turn up as synchronicities, the occasional parapsychological phenomenon, and then people who turn up in your life as psychopomps for a while and then disappear. And you look back and it says, that all made sense. That guy, that woman, they helped me and then they went. And all these opportunities appeared. And why I didn't push too hard and I wasn't so tense and I wasn't so angry. Things started to work. And there's the big hint. You're coherent with field infodynamic regulation. And the trickster does not present as the trickster, but it is there. And that's one of the most adaptive positions that we can take to this particular regulatory dynamic. So, moving on from there, let's get to the solution to the first card. So we start in the same place. The trickster is a field function of homeostasis. Got that. Then we need to understand that it's representation. I've put understanding in this time rather than it's. Because when we fall victim to this, there is no understanding. But once we understand that its representation mirrors maturity in individuals and in cultures, we have a consolidated cognitive position that is informed by instinct and emotion, informed by the proper representations, and is intuitive friendly. And from that understanding comes something which is beyond cognition, but samples all of those other metapolia, and is meaning. We now have a meaning for where I am in my life in relationship to culture and what other people are doing that's misfired and is harming themselves and harming others. So understand that the mirror it holds reflects our development. So if someone is offended or even disgusted by the representations of puerile, adolescent, theriomorphic representations as a trickster, and fouling themselves and people and corrupting them, if they get off on that, they are immature. There's no question about that. They are dangerously immature and misdirecting. If you can hold the view as no non-attachment to that, because if I do attach, my instincts will generate revulsion and push me away. Okay, I'm not to that. I accept that. That's not where I should be going. What's a proper relationship to this thing which is called the trickster by these people who are trying to influence me? That's when you get cognitive understanding that leads to meaning. The meaning ultimately will come from intuition, being intuitively receptive. And I say this side, it is experienced as mercurial or hermetic and is Janus faced. And I add, this persona is intentional. Understand why. That was missing before in the first card. So being Janus faced, looking in two directions at the same time, is not only like the Greek tragedy masks where there's one laughing and there's one sad face, and it's not a simple binary opposite, but it's the bandwidth of everything in between of that is present. And the persona is to get you to see that it's not that simple. If we look at the duality and are pulled into it, then we are in that cognitive reductive trap that I mentioned earlier, which is neurotogenic. It causes or defines neurosis to be in that kind of state, where you can experience apparent opposites, but look into the field that connects them, and you realize everything can change and will change, except if we don't look and we don't relate. Then it changes without us, we don't notice. There is no relationship to us. So relating is important. How do we relate to the entire field? So there aren't only stark opposites present, but also the idea of looking in two directions at the same time in two different ways is an extension of consciousness in and of itself. There's one thing that happens with neurotic polarities is that if we don't simply go into inertia and do nothing, we will focus on one or the other. And when we do, we make a compensatory enemy of the other pole that we're not looking at. So if we look too much at morality and we're a Jungian, we create the shadow, we create it. by generating the opposite. This is why so many Christians have such trouble between Jesus Christ and Lucifer. The opposites are generated by the way that they conceive their understanding of spirituality. That's their right to do that, of course, because that's their belief system. But it is neurotogenic, and that's why they suffer the way that they do with things like guilt. And we've discussed guilt complexes, legitimate and illegitimate guilt, and the like. Whereas the trickster would prefer us not to have to focus on opposites, which just causes oscillation between polarities, but to see deeply into the field and relate to it. That reduces pressure immediately. This side then, it will act with complexes unless you understand compensation. Because complexes then become the agent of the trickster presenting something which is so uncomfortable we have to do something about it. And if we just go along with it and give in, that's why the pressure for compensation arises. The genome will fire instinctive pressure at us, and the trickster will utilize that as fuel to compensate for the complex's compensation for us in order to overcome the complex. But that drives that pressure to such an extent that it's anxiety. You feel it as anxiety. Can you receive the anxiety and convert it? You are being asked to convert the representation of drive pressure into something which is transcendent and enlightening. You're not being asked to utilize it to harm yourself or to feed the complex. What does it take to get you, the ego, to pay attention to this natural homeostatic compensatory drive? Unfortunately, it seems a lot, because we're not generally aware of the compensatory direction of instincts, and the role of the trickster is concealed by the crap that's out there in the culture. It does not help us to understand this at all. But the trickster, being the trickster, will utilize it to say, isn't this shit? Don't you realize that? Can't you understand this is absolute nonsense? Can't you see into the background and the state of the individuals who are pushing this? Why are you trying to compensate for your own superiority by being inferior and attaching yourself to them? What are you guilty about? There is no legitimate guilt in your life. This, if you like, is the algorithmic reasoning put into cognitive verbal frame for how these compensatory dynamics work through. I've said again what I said before. Understand that its innate sentience is at the field level of meta-intuition. I've just been describing that in more detail, which is why it's left as a statement here and it's not been changed from the first card. Over here, exchange the occult for synchronicity in parapsychology. Drop the occult, but experience synchronicities. Allow yourself to receive them, not superstitiously, but receive them. The same with parapsychological phenomena, because one thing is for sure, if you go in depth genuinely and authentically, then parapsychological phenomena will occur. But you'll get a bunching up of synchronicities first, which tells you that another level of communication from the non-ego is on its way. And that communication is coming ultimately from the Platonic field and will be mediated in this instance through the trickster as the exemplar of the compensatory dynamic. So over here, humor is part of its regulatory field, as is irony, which we said before, but I said show insight and wisdom over this. So your capacity, our capacity, any of us, to understand this will be picked up on the inside. Part of that is non-attachment, and I mean that at the highest register of attachment, where you get completely taken over, which you mentioned before, Paul. And this can happen with comedians.
Oh, yeah.
So many of them become eventually depressed, burned out, and perhaps self-harm, even suicide, because they've been burnt out by identification with the trickster and the pressure to reproduce that continuously. But when it's understood as a regulatory field, and you show insight by holding that notion consciously within your ego, and wisdom, the understanding of its purpose, then there's no need for that to be amped up in any kind of compensation towards the personal ego of the individual concerned. because you're in a reasonable state of harmonic resonance with why humor and irony are effective as they are. So also don't identify in a negative way with humor as being harmful. If it's being used harmfully towards you, you have an opportunity to convert that into something which reconfigures other people's approach to you. Because humor is that powerful. It can make people completely see us differently. Because you provide something for them they're not providing for themselves. And knowing that is part of that insight and wisdom that I'm suggesting that is important, and then understanding how that will feed into the regulatory dynamic of the trickster function and its field. So learn to observe its superposition field states. This is important again at the beginning, saying that most of us don't know that this, consciously anyway, though we feel its effects, don't know that it even exists. We need to know that it occupies several states simultaneously and regulates their interactions. If we can observe that, we become congruent with it. There is a resonance which it will detect. In the same way that in therapy, the rapport field communicates at a deep level a resonance between people. Trickster can do that in relationship to an individual, provided you know and understand and internally represent this is that regulatory function at work. I respect it, and I'll do everything I can to make my contribution at as many levels as I can. So I have my own self-interest and I have collective interest in that. So that then makes you more harmonic and congruent with it. This is the most important one, really, in many regards. Do not identify with it. Do not reify it. Don't turn it into a person or a figure, or unless it's within something that can contain it. And that could be a movie, a novel, things like that. But it has to be contained within the boundary. As you guys, I know, understand how sandtrays work, how mandalas are supposed to work. A sandtray is a mandala in 3 dimensions, which involves the placement of things that relate to one another as a field. So when you say that is the trickster, but the representation of it is a summation of factors beyond the image of it, even within a novel or a movie, then you can relate to it within that bounded area, that bounded dimension. But if there is no boundary and you identify with it and you've reified it, that's trouble. That's on your way to inflation, and at some point it will turn on us. Understand that it is a natural info-dynamic at the platonic field level. It goes all the way down and it goes all the way up, and it's in service of that. It's in service of the platonic field. Understand that its role includes testing potential in people and cultures, even ultimately at the species level. So again, its superpositioning means what it does operates scale invariantly at the level of the individual and right the way up. And we can see it, we can observe it within ourselves and others. You immediately then have a relationship to it, which doesn't try and possess it. Identification with it tries to possess it. That's dangerous. I can't emphasize that too much. That is super dangerous, unless it's using you as an efficient cause to regulate other people. But at some point, you will run out of your capital, if you like, over that. You won't be able to deploy that anymore, and then it turns on you. And even that is represented in myth and fairy tales. There's only so much and so far you can push something like that, which is far, far too big to be contained. So when we understand it right, again, you're sending a signal inwardly towards the wider ego and its field that, yeah, I understand this, and I know that it's testing me and it tests cultures. I have to rise to meet that and demonstrate through my action in the world, which does not mean inflation. It might mean taking a rest from engaging with certain things because it's not propitious to do so. It might be dangerous. It's understanding what conservation might mean. That's all self-regulation. So being aware of the infodynamic field and how it regulates all these scale and variant ways suggests that you are integrated, not disintegrated or collapsed. So that's really important. That's why we say learn to receive it before you follow it. If you follow something that just appears that you've not actually received, but it's ingressed into you, and this is again in support of Michael Levin's remark the other day, and we always say receive and then follow, not the other way around. But if you do follow something before you understand what it is, you then get mythopoetically the Pied Piper phenomenon, whereby you have to give up a huge portion of yourself over to the piper, who will invariably lead you into overcompensation for your inflation. And this abyss which all the pseudo-Nietzschean Petersonian types fear so much exists for them in the future, insofar as they adhere to that misdirection from that internet personality. So be very, very careful. Understand its relationship to the role of the psychopomp, which I'm going to cover on that diagram, which I think you're going to be familiar with shortly. But in summary, the simplest way of saying it is learn to take it tense. And even the Jungians say that. I think it was Marie-Louise von Franz, bless her, who said that. If you can't take a hint from life, life will hit you. That's a reasonable way of summarizing this. Learn to take the compensatory hints. So I was going to look at the diagram which describes the process of this. Before I get there, though, would anybody like to comment on anything at this stage? It's heavy stuff, isn't it? I appreciate that. Okay, let's go back to this. You've probably seen this from the personal myth guide, but it still holds true. The ontology and superposition of the psychodynamic trickster function. So we start with the genome, of course, because that's the materiality into which the Platonic instantiates. And then we have our unfolding life and development. Homeostasis has to be there pretty much immediately. Some of it is generated through the family and the environment, caregivers and so on, which gives complexes a head start, of course, because we form complexes around our parents, perhaps our siblings. But what happens then is that, say, regulating homeostasis does its best. And then psychopomps will appear. And they may be extended family members. They may be, if we're lucky, guides in the form of teachers, experienced adults, or even older children who fulfill that role of not containing or distracting our life, not wanting to control us, but come in with the right guidance at the right time. And the most effective ones are ones who are unobtrusive. You wouldn't know that they had the insight, the ingression of wisdom that comes out from them, but they are so field sensitive that they can do it. And they're field sensitive enough to barefoot practice. You feel the ground beneath their feet. They know when to walk in and when to walk out of someone's life and to what extent. This is an ideal unfoldment. And as we move on in life, though, if we're not careful anyway, deal with things properly, we get the polarized representation of the trickster because we've not taken the advice of the guiding psychopomps that we meet along the way. Homeostasis has been disrupted perhaps because of early influences, and the genome is frustrated. So what steps in? The polarized trickster. Why is it polarized? Because it has to show us the gap, the missing field of understanding between the opposites. And that will try its best to get us to understand. But after that, we then get synchronicities. And not because we're doing the right thing, in this case, and being informed by them, but because we're doing the wrong things. The synchronicity started to give us this big hint that we're not adapting. What do we do with the synchronicities? Do we say that's all irrational, or it's just, fantasy or fairy tale or whatever it might be, superstition, and we don't correct? Then the exteriorizations can start, and that can be poltergeist, another parapsychological phenomenon. And all of this within the context of a superposition field, which includes the past, the present, and the future trajectory interacting, in the case of the future, with the past and the present before the future's even happened. And that's because of the algorithms which interpret possible outcomes and move us in particular directions. The most efficient field-wide regulator of that is the Trickster. Because the Trickster will say, well, we've got several ways of handling this, and all these future possibilities exist. They are superpositioned simultaneously, like a quantum state of potential futures, all of which are valid and are true. But one of them, for us as an individual, will ultimately work itself through out of that matrix of superposition information. But it's a tortuous path if we don't take the hints. And once the Trickster kicks in, if the Trickster says, over to you synchronicity, over to you exteriorization, then the real hints start to come in a way that you cannot ignore. When objects start to move, when there's weird electrical phenomena, when there's a whole field of apparent coincidences that go beyond coincidence, all occurring at the same time, you couldn't get bigger hints that you need to stop what you're doing and ask to be allowed to receive. And then you'll get the inrush of imagery, which initially, and we said this so many times, and Tantrism bears this out, initially are going to be the representations of complexes, as if to say, this is the state you're in, this is what you're afraid of, and then it's an illusion caused by your attachment to them and your non-attachment when you repressed them. So they went off and became autonomous. Now the attachment is unconscious, but it's still there. And this is it. This is the state you're in, time to do something about it. And then the process unfolds. If fortunately such a person has a really competent therapist, then they can be helped through that. In the absence of that, it can be a rough road of maladaptation to eventual adaptation. So that's pretty much how the ontology and superposition of the Trickster operates. It emerges out from early states of psychological consciousness and psychosocial relationship. We meet people who help us. They're psychopomps. We like them. They seem to like us. That's great. And then things get more complicated as life develops, and we meet frustrations beyond only the family. And that's when the Trickster starts to operate to try to guide us, unless we can go back to the psychopomp stage, which is important. And I think it'd be worth going to that next, actually, just a little bit of the information that we've built up around that. Oh, any questions on that so far? Oh, you're okay. Right, I might have to go backwards again here. I'll read through this. This is something we can look at later. The Trickster is the manifestation of an extended homeostatic function present in a superpositioned field relationship between the various biopsychosocial systems that make up the continuum of a human being with their environment. That one paragraph gives you an outline of what this thing is. It is typically reified in the manner represented by myth, narrative, dream, and symbols as a mediating personality, animal or animal-human theriomorph. But each such collapsed waveform representation of what I've just said is continuous with the wider superposition field that deploys and regulates this function. The diagram we've just looked at shows the characteristic ontology of this function and its representation. Let's move past it now. Homeostasis is the regulating drive from the genome and can be interpreted as the manifestation of the survival or self-preservation instinct as a process dynamic. In other words, homeostasis is in service at the biological level, at the genomic level of self-preservation and survival. This is the baseline against which all adaptations are measured biopsychosocially. This is why PANCSEP is as insistent as it is, because it's all about baseline adaptation. But when PANCSEP becomes incongruent with the environment because there's no context to receive it, PANCSEP can go all neurotic. literally providing the drive pressure for us to split, and that leads to neurosis. The scenarios, though, are present within the genome, the platonic field, and they are meta-instincts. The guiding psychopomp is the first manifestation of the trickster function that appears in compensation for latent potential that we have, that is not being actualized in the individual. This aspect of the trickster is reified in myths and dreams, as, for example, a wise old man, or sometimes a humble, unexpected guide. When an individual fails to accept the indirect suggestions of the guiding psychopomp, the homeostatic regulating function will morph into the polarized trickster. The polarity in the trickster represents both the duality present in neurosis, as polarized opposition, and the necessity of going beyond this by revelation of hidden informational field processes beyond the subject's present level of consciousness and adaptation, which is a reasonably complicated way of saying that behind our distress and suffering is the representation of our potential to become optimized and adapted to life. We must not then focus on the representation. As we were saying earlier, the Tantric Buddhists understand that the first thing you get is going to be negative, because that's emitted by the complexes to protect themselves. But then those wrathful deities, as the Tantric Buddhists consider them to be, although they know they're not real, turn into peaceful deities, which they know are not real, because both are projections of what they call bodhicitta, or enlightened mind, which basically is a platonic level of consciousness. If the polarized trickster is not successful in regulating the individual's subjective waveform or field, in other words, what we actually experienced, compensation extends via the wider field into the environment and can be experienced as meaningful coincidences or synchronicities that constellate superpositioned representations of resonant informational states. That supports what I was saying earlier, but it perhaps makes it a little bit easier to follow. Poltergeist and psychokinetic exteriorization occurs downstream of a high-intensity period of synchronicity. The exteriorization, like synchronicity, should be considered an extension of homeostasis by superpositioning of information into a resonant field state between a subject and their environment. This can include with and between people and things. The trickster function may then be reified as a poltergeist, and through shared experience and suggestion, that is, influence of the objective waveform of the resonant field. In other words, the objective waveform, because that's anything that extends beyond the subject of the individual, includes representations within culture, but that's only part of that much wider field, which we can go beyond. And the shared experience of people, the collective psyche, if you like, and the suggestion and influence of those representations may cause the trickster function to become reified, turned into a personality. Even a poltergeist is treated very often as if it's a person, rather than as a force of representation which is exteriorized. All these 5 stages are present, at the very least in potentia, simultaneously, because it's a field. The field can flip into earlier states or move rapidly into a more advanced one. The precise configuration at any one time for any one individual or group will depend on how the objective waveform collapses into representation. Therefore, the dynamic properties of the trickster function mean that it can recurse into any previous stage and then back again, depending upon how the regulated process is managing itself. We said earlier, it's all about management. i.e., does the ego get it? Does the ego know what's going on? Or is it too preoccupied with the influence and suggestion of other people or its complexes? The purpose of the trickster function is to regulate an individual or group homeostatically. It is an extension of the normal understanding of biological homeostasis into psychology and the social and the natural environment. It is ultimately controlled by the genome and by behavioral, morphogenic, and platonic fields. And they're all pretty much upstream of things that we normally consider, but they are affecting us all the time. The genome comes with them. It is not something that you can separate from them. We've always said this. This, for example, is drawn from writings from 2021. I hadn't even heard of Michael Levin then, and Michael Levin now is saying pretty much the same kind of thing from a different perspective. He's finding the evidence for it. Now, how it tricks you, these charge you the individuation neurosis. And here's something I said in 2022, which I think still has some value. Trickster is best considered to be a nested field of fields that collapses into resolutions based on those fields. So in other words, when we look at something, we get a resolution of understanding. And the trickster, as it settles into that level of resolution, adopts the characteristics of that which it is dropped into and adopts the resolution of it. This is a way, again, of understanding the negative influence of gurus, that they occupy a state, and that if we see or experience or imagine even unconsciously that we're experiencing the trickster through them, we're actually downloading the influence of the intent of that person. So we have to be really, really careful. It is continuous beyond biology, psychology, and the social world with universal, fundamental, organizational fields, the ones that you're familiar with. Its differentiation into biology collapses into the level of evolutionary development of the species. So in other words, our evolution is imprinted and conserved with how the trickster itself has evolved as a regulatory process. So the anticipation of the trickster at the meta-instinct and therefore genomic level is congruent with the experiences in the past, which then get projected into culture and become what Jungians think are archetypal images. But more than that, they're whole scenarios, and they are highly conserved. It isn't one thing as such, rather it's a meta-regulator. We've discussed that. Its association with parapsychological phenomenon is a feature of its dynamic interfield nature. Individual human ego consciousness and its collective concomitants out in the culture and society organize the meta-regulatory field into the familiar, mythic, poetic, and occult representations of the trickster. Again, we've gone over this several times, and pretty much in the last paragraph as I've discussed that, I raise this again. In that regard, we are obliged to reflexively consider it in that form. In other words, its representation is a real representation, but it is not the thing in and of itself. In our experience, that is very important to understand about whatever imagery arises apparently spontaneously from within. It's always a door to something else. The minute we collapse into reifying the image and saying that is so real, that is all there is, we stop at that level and then invite a response, a compensatory one, which might be you'll get another image or you won't get anything at all because you've not earned the right to go beyond this one. Again, this is something that the East understands. So, again, where was I? Human unconscious collective concomitant. Yeah. In that regard, we are obliged to reflexively consider it in that form, whilst at the same time distilling out the true deep structure dynamics of its function. Human nature creates the imago of the trickster in its own image. So when you get these people who find amusement in a very amorphic, animalistic, puerile representation of the trickster, they actually focus on that. Then that's telling you everything you need to know about them. Their nature has created the imago of the trickster that they are attractive to in their own image. It's so basic. It's not even Jungian 101. It's below Jungian 101. It is so basic. That understanding will help to free you from the influence of such people. They're just literally showing their backside and the level of their understanding. And if you're drawn in by that, you are entrapped. And really, that's not a healthy state to be in for any of us. And I think that's all of the cards. Let's just whiz back through them. We've covered a heck of a lot. Oh no, we got this one just at the beginning. Again, this is from a long time ago, and this is from the Personal Myth versus 2020. A lot of what we think we see are mirages taken in through suggestion from, in this current climate, pop Jungian entrepreneurs and gurus. You may need a basic reframe conceptually of how you're expressing interest in yourself. The psyche has a trickster function, and that, more than any shadow, is something to watch out for. And here, a trickster finds thoughts for underused minds to think. So, if you're not optimizing your potential, it will go for you. And it will go for you through fear in order to kickstart you to snap out of it. It will go for you in fantasy, so you feel the pain of withdrawal from real life. It will turn up as OCD. It will turn up as introverted intuition, being pulled into introverted fantastical images. It will do all of that in order to destabilize you enough to shock you out of the state of attachment to non-reality that you've drifted into. You, I mean that for any of us, of course. So that's why they're there, and that's why that was the first slide beyond the thumbnail in this presentation for today. A lot to go for it. But that's it. And we're bang on time at 4 o'clock. But we'll take questions if anybody would like to ask any. We can always follow this up with another sort of private seminar if anyone would like to do that. And I'd certainly like to follow up on Ryan's suggestion as well, because there's so much in that.
Ask one quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
I mean, when you talk about, it's about the ego, this trickster function trying to test the ego if it knows what's going on. And I mean, we think about that. I'm sure, like in context of the theory, like to be able to see a lot of what you've been saying today. But for someone that's just completely unaware of the theory, obviously these same processes play out.
Yeah.
So what does it look like in someone like who doesn't know any of what we've talked about today? Is it just that they kind of can see that the synchronicities, or the things that the trickster does, it makes them realize that they're not following their potential, that they're not living up to their potential?
That's another great question, because we started today by saying the most important thing is the lived experience of real people who don't have a technical understanding of what goes on, because that's the majority, the overwhelming majority of people. And a lot of people get through. They get through without any help. They get through because at one level, hints take sufficiently for them to change. But in those cases where someone gets stuck, usually under the influence of third parties, whether that's in the family, the workplace, it's on the internet, wherever it might be, when they get stuck and form the wrong kind of attachment and a maladaptation to the influence of others, that's when they generally turn up in therapy. And when they do, when we work with someone, the cleanest way of all, the simplest way, is to use dissociation. And then to use representations and how they change with safe dissociation. So not chemically induced ones, not authoritarianly induced, as some forms of hypnosis are, but collaborative, permissive forms of dissociation that they feel are participants and regulator of themselves. That clears so much away. It's the most fundamental skill, and we would not be without it, would we?
No.
Everything would be a conversation otherwise, in an ordinary sense, and would involve a high burden of theory. And that extends things. And that's what you see with the Jungians and the Freudians. It just goes on forever, whilst they manufacture problems because their approach is incorrect. And they don't understand the dissociability of the psyche. And that dissociability is normal. which is why abnormal states can utilize normal processes to generate and maintain themselves. It is so simple when we approach it in that way. People self-correct very, very quickly once they feel that separation, but without a dissolution of their being. There's still an aggro boundary with non-attachment. That just switches and moves things so quickly and so smoothly. Of course, sometimes we need to augment that. Often we do with creative therapies, for example, sand trays, art, music, enactments. But none of those downstream effects are ever separated off. They're superpositioned with hypnosis and trance states. And that makes it efficient, makes it quick, and makes it natural. That was such a good question. I'm so glad you've raised that point, because that's allowed us to bring clarity on that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to ask anything? We're all happy? It was heavy, wasn't it? I apologise for that, but there's more to do on this topic. And so we can do that in private seminars. So for now, we can call it a day. Bless you all.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.